A viewer. Yeah, we're not doing that. Sweeney Todd, from musicals to television to novels to legend, the macabre tale of this scornful British barber and his entrepreneurial patisserie partner has intrigued audiences around the globe. Todd has won accolades, he's defined careers, and he's been a real source of ambiguity in terms of his origin, because like every mythos of intrigue, it would seem that the sources were just somehow thanosed out of existence. Which unfortunately gives rise to the question as to whether or not he was a real person, but we'll come back to that later. The tale, for all of its variations, tells us the story of a barber and a baker working in tandem with one another. The barber murdering his clients during their shave, and the baker hiding the evidence within the pies. This is a tale that more or less everyone knows. Scarily enough, between the few real murdering barbers and the very many fictional murdering barbers, there's quite a lot of sources to go through that delve into propaganda, history, bonkers academia, and even some real murder. So let's get started. But this time, we're not going to Fleet Street straight away. No. We're going to begin this story in Paris. Ah, bonjour. Yeah, we're not doing that. So, why Paris, I hear you ask? Well, in Rue de la Harpe, a quiet residential area within the heart of Paris's Latin Quarter, is thought to be where the barber and baker connection began. Joseph Fouché, the Parisian chief of Napoleon's police and controversial executioner of Lyons, supposedly documented in an 1816 Archives de la Police a series of grisly murders that took place between a barber and a baker on that very street. However, it should be noted that this archive is just not archived, and is our first piece of thanos evidence that we have that everyone likes to cite when discussing the origins and/or adaptations of Sweeney Todd. In general, and for reference, there are many adaptations of Sweeney Todd and the story of Rue de la Harpe, so much so that these early iterations are largely speculative and/or future publications wrongly cited as the original. And it's all just a little bit confusing, but don't worry, I'm here to help. So without further ado, the skeleton of the tale is thus. A barber is murdering his clientele, and a usually male baker is putting the corpses into some kind of pastry and/or patty as a way to generate profit. The duo are discovered for some reason or another, sometimes by a dog, sometimes incited by an angry mob, but they are eventually tried and executed on the rack, sometimes with the year being 1801 for the execution. Then the barbershop and the bakery were torn down to the ground in response to their crimes. Unfortunately, this is as basic as it can be without adding future influence or future adaptations into it. This is just the skeleton to work from. So we have two parts to this mystery that would really validate a version of it. One, did Fouché actually write this? And number two, did these events actually happen, or something similar to these events actually happen? Fouché was accredited with creating this tale based on very little evidence that we have access to today, but we know enough that he was definitely suspected to have written something on the matter. Well, a suggested influence for Fouché writing about the story in the first place goes back to some 14th century ballads that were recited by the Parisians about a murderous barber and baker working together. But again, without concrete evidence, it's difficult to justify. I did find some modern translations of what was supposed to be the ballad, but because it referenced modern materials such as I'll polish him off and a female baker, I threw it out. Nevertheless, it's extremely possible that some kind of folklore and/or ballad was an influence for Fouché and/or the Parisians to speculate the idea that the story even happened. It is well known that two buildings were torn down in Rue de la Harpe at the time the crime supposedly happened, which roused obviously local suspicion. However, there is also evidence to suggest that those buildings were torn down to make access for the National Museum of the Middle Ages. So, without the ballads, or Fouché's original accounts, it's difficult to justify how exactly this story became popular in France at the time. In my opinion, it was a mixture of poverty, poor industrial practice such as adulteration, but also some classism and fear perpetuated by wealthy Europeans and Frenchmen who created tales of lower class savagery as a reaction to the revolution. And who knows, they may have used some old ballads to supplement their cause. A version of the tale of Rue de la Harpe ended up crossing the Channel to merry old England in 1825 and was used for the same purpose I believe it was created, as a piece of propaganda. But let's just delve a little into what London has to offer in the way of murderous barbers and cannibal pies before I tell all in the telltale. It's interesting to note a couple of London cases that led to further repurposing and repackaging of this gory tale with similar themes. Before Fouche had an alleged chance to let his imagination run riot in a supposed archival document, the London Chronicle reported on the 2nd of December 1784 of a most remarkable murder perpetrated by a journeyman barber, which recounted the events of a barber in Hyde Park who apparently couldn't bring it home to his wife and suspected his friend of giving her certain favours. In his suspicions, during a shave, he cut the man from ear to ear in a fit of jealous rage and then fled. The murder was reprinted in the Annual Register from 1784 to 85, but the fate of the Hyde Park barber who couldn't bring it home to his wife remains a mystery. It's all very well having a murderous barber, but what about the meat pies? Where are the British cannibals I hear you roar? Well, a suggested influence goes forward to 1818, where writer/publisher, sometimes thought of as a bit of a gossip,
James Catnach,
published a ballad about the butchers of Drury Lane, namely Thomas Pizzy of Blackmore Street. Catnach claimed that Pizzy, alongside others, had been using human meat in their sausages. An angry mob crashed down against Pizzy's shop, beating up the man in the process. Well, in those days, all ballads were published with the author's name and address on the ballad, so it wasn't particularly very clever of Catnach to do this without any kind of evidence. Pizzy sued for malicious libel, won, and Catnach served a 6-month sentence in jail. If only Twitter could operate like this. John Pitts, one of Catnach's competitors, published a ballad about the events not long after. Poor Pizzy was in an awful mess and looked the colour of cinders. A crowd assembled from far and near and they smashed in all his windows. Now Jemmy Catnach's gone to prison, and what's he gone to prison for? For printing a libel against Mr. Pizzy which was sung from door to door. Additionally, and rather oddly, British anthropologist Peter Haining made quite bold claims that there was in fact a real Sweeney Todd. Peter Haining writes that Sweeney Todd was born on the 26th of October 1756 and was hanged near Newgate Prison on the 23rd of January 1802. Now, Marvin Kaye wrote on the matter. I have several of Haining's books in my library and sometimes doubt his scholarship, but these dates are so specific it should be an easy matter for someone to prove or disprove whether the demon barber really did or did not live, and yet here we still are. It's largely discredited, but at the very least Peter Haining believed he had some kind of evidentiary backing that there was a real Sweeney Todd demon Barber of Fleet Street. But I threw it out. A combination of these stories is thought to be what created the genesis or concept of Sweeney Todd, or at least it tells us that murdering barbers and cannibal pies was at least trending in London by the time the story of Rue de la Harpe had made it across. This is even further evidence when we even note that Charles Dickens was referencing these themes post the Telltale. Speaking of, as mentioned earlier, Fouche's missing archive of the story of Rue de la Harpe had miraculously made its way to London, because by 1823-25 it was published in a magazine named The Telltale under the title of A Terrific Story of the Rue de la Harpe, claiming the story to be true, of course. This account is sometimes credited to have been written by Thomas Peckett Prest, but he would have been 14 at the time, so I hold my reservations. From what I can see, there are no widely available copies of the 1825 version, which has just opened the floodgates of misinformation. A lot of people claim that the Telltale added a lot of variables that would eventually become the String of Pearls, such as the pearls and a female baker, but they are, from what I can see, completely wrong. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to utilise the 1836 version of this story from this book, which has the craziest title ever. The Wonders of the Universe, or Curiosities of Nature and Art, including memoirs and anecdotes of wonderful and eccentric characters of every age from the earliest period to the present time. Rolls right off the tongue. This book contains 3 pages worth of material which doesn't reference any kind of future adaptation material, such as the change from terrific to terrible in the title. It's worth noting that in this era, fact-checking and copywriting just weren't as prevalent as they are today. For example, Thomas Becket Prest from before wrote a lampoon on Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist, named The Life and Adventures of Oliver Twist, the workhouse boy in 1841. Which of course is part of the reason as to why it's so difficult to figure out who the original author was, how this story came to Britain in the first place, or even if the version that we have is just multiple sources spliced into one. But the 1836 version is as close as we're going to get to the singular truth. It's the one that is utilised the most by the more credible Sweeney Todd academics, and in my opinion, is the one that's most canonical. This version of the story tells us about 2 businessmen who are visiting the main city of Paris. One of them decides to get a shave by a barber in Rue de la Harpe. The businessmen, from what I can see, don't have names. Nobody has names, not even the baker and the barber, so just to be completely clear, I'm not giving them names either. Businessman 1 is getting a shave, and Businessman 2 goes out to run errands in the main city of Paris. They have a dog, which sits outside and waits for Businessman 1 to be done with his shave. Businessman 2 returns from his errands and discovers that Businessman 1 has completely vanished and his dog is in a complete state of anxiety. The barber claims not to know anything about Businessman 1's whereabouts, and when pressed by Businessman 2, becomes frustrated. You would think that one of these fictional barbers would realise that this was a terrible plan. Businessman 2 refuses to leave and summons for the police as a crowd begins to gather. They all unanimously search the shop for Businessman 1. And yet, there is no trace of Businessman 1. It would seem he's completely vanished into thin air. The dog ferociously attacks the barber, causing him to conveniently faint. The dog then leads them down into the basement, through an aperture in the wall, and into somebody else's cellar, where they discover the body of Businessman 1. So, what was next door, I hear you ask? Well, why, it's the bakery. And weren't they famous for their savoury meat pies? Oops, turns out they were chopped up people. This was all an elaborate scheme to get rich, which unfortunately didn't quite work out for the barber and the baker because they were tried and executed on the rack. Due to the severe nature of the crimes, the buildings were torn down so that no human would ever inhabit that spot again. A terrific story of the Rue de la Harpe was circulated in both Britain and in France. However, in Britain, it was likely used as a piece of propaganda to cement the idea that the French were barbarians as a reaction to the revolution, as opposed to the idea that a 14-year-old heard about this story or found Fouche's missing account of it, translated it, and then brought it back to London. It's also worth noting that from around 1790 until the early 19th century, cannibalistic art and literature was used as a reaction to the French Revolution as a piece of pro-monarchy propaganda, or simply because it was trending. So just to reiterate, bastardizing others' work for profit in this era was completely fine and fair. And in some cases today it still is. Let the dream begin. So how do we take this jumbled mess of plagiarism and turn it into Sweeney Todd? Well, first of all, we have to find out how he got his name, and luckily, we're now moving on to that piece. So, in November 1846, the People's Periodical and Family Library, edited by Edward Lloyd, began serialising the story of Rue de la Harpe under the title of The String of Pearls, a romance, although sometimes it was also known as The Gift of the Sailor. It's arguably written by James Malcolm Rymer, though sometimes our friend Thomas Becket Prest comes into the picture to take some kind of credit for it. Also, other names get thrown around like George McFarren, or a mixture of all of these writers together. Either way, The String of Pearls is our first literary edition that involves the duo of Sweeney Todd and Mrs. Lovett, with their rightful names. However, it also introduces some other important characters to the mix that become staples later down the line, such as Joanna, Tobias Ragg, and even the Beadle. Here's a summary. Set in 1785, not long after the 1784 journeyman barber murder, if you can recall, the story begins with the murder of Lieutenant Thornhill in Sweeney Todd's barbershop via a mechanical revolving chair, which kind of drops Lieutenant Thornhill to his death. Thornhill had come to London to bring a gift of a string of pearls for the lover of a missing sailor named Mark Ingistry, who is presumed to be lost at sea. The lover, who the pearls are a gift for, is a woman named Joanna Oakley. Joanna, seeking closure about what happened to Mark, decides to speak to Mr. Jeffrey about it. Now, Mr. Jeffrey owns a ship who found Lieutenant Thornhill. Lieutenant Thornhill and Mark were both lost at sea, and this is how Thornhill came into the possession of the string of pearls for Joanna. He says he'll look into it, but everyone is just a bit like, Joanna, he's dead, get over it. However, upon discovering that Lieutenant Thornhill has gone missing with the string of pearls, Mr. Jeffrey decides to confide in his friend, Captain Rathbone, about this peculiar situation and what they can do about it. Well, the last place that Thornhill was seen was entering Sweeney Todd's barbershop to get a shave. Additionally, sat outside that same barbershop is his obedient dog Hector, who is waiting for him to return. So it seems like an easy place to start, right? Sweeney admits that Thornhill did have a shave, but then went into the street to start a fight, which, you know, is a common thing to happen here in Britain after a shave. Mr. Jeffries and Rathbone both immediately suspect Sweeney of killing Thornhill for the pearls because, like, well, yeah. What a story. So they go in there pretending to be jewelers to try and get Sweeney to produce the pearls for them as a type of evidentiary support about what's happened. But Sweeney does not bite, and he can see exactly right through what they're trying to do, and he asks them to leave the shop. They leave, but they are adamant that they will seek further answers to what's going on there. At this point, Mrs. Lovett is introduced as a beautiful, buxom young woman who is very popular for her meat pies and bell yard. An emaciated and poor man named Jarvis Williams comes to Mrs. Lovett's pie shop in a desperate form, asking for work. Mrs. Lovett tells him to come back in a couple hours and she may have an opening for him. During this time, she kills her current cook and sees an opportunity to hire Jarvis in exchange for food instead of money. He takes this job. At the same time, Joanna, seeing that nobody has really procured any results about what's happened to Mark, decides to dress up as a boy, or creates the plan to dress up as a boy and enter Sweeney Todd's pie shop. Oh my god.
Sweeney Todd's pie shop.
Which she will dress up as a boy and apply for work in Sweeney Todd's barbershop so that she can see for herself what is going on. Meanwhile, Tobias Ragg, an often beaten child assistant to Sweeney Todd, grows increasingly suspicious of the activity that's going on within Sweeney's shop. This begins when he almost walks in on the murder of Lieutenant Thornhill, and Sweeney acts quite violently to Tobias in reaction to this, and is only ever increased by the fact that Hector, Thornhill's dog, won't leave the premises. To keep Tobias quiet, Sweeney threatens him with this story/concocted story that Tobias's mother is some kind of thief, and that Sweeney will tell everyone that she's a thief. If he tells anyone about the suspicions of murdering people in his shop. After a couple of failed attempts to sell the pearls, Sweeney manages to find a moneylender who is willing to part with an £8,000 loan in exchange for them. Sweeney realises that Tobias knows a little bit too much about his real trade when Tobias discovers wealthy gentlemen's clothes and jewels whilst Sweeney was out trying to flog the pearls. Sweeney then strangles Tobias until he passes out. If that wasn't bad enough, Sweeney then decides to take the unconscious body of Tobias Ragg to the nearby mental asylum owned by Mr. Fogg. He then subsequently pays Mr. Fogg with some of that pearl money to kill Tobias whilst under his care. Killing any Tom, Dick and Harry was apparently in Sweeney's trade, but when it came to dogs and children, he apparently had some kind of mercy. Meanwhile, the church next door to Mrs. Lovett's pie shop notices an absolutely foul stench that is coming from an unidentifiable source. Jarvis Williams, after engorging himself on pies, begins to feel that he may have the strength to leave and find different types of work. However, he notices writing on the wall that claims he will never leave and that she will keep him a prisoner there forever. After monologuing out loud about how much he would like to leave this kind of situation, a demonic voice, aka Sweeney Todd, informs him that he is going to stay and work within the pie shop forever. Mr. Jeffrey and Wraithbone plan on questioning Tobias about the actions of Sweeney Todd, but when they get to the shop, they discover that only Todd is there. They witness a customer go into the barber shop and not come out at all, which completely confirms their suspicions about Sweeney Todd. They decide to tell a High Court judge about the matter, Sir Richard Blunt, and they also use the smell of St. Dunstan's church in aid of this kind of he's murdering people and hiding them behind the church type thing. Blunt, alongside the Beadle, goes to the church to identify the source of the smell, thinking that if they could find some kind of hard evidence there, then they can use that against Sweeney Todd. And lo and behold, in the tunnels of the church, they discover dozens of bodies piling up, all dismembered. It's funny also to note that at the end of this episode, after all of this trauma and shocking things that they've seen in St. Dunstan's church, they leave and they commentate on how beautiful and gorgeous the pies are in Mrs. Lovett's shop and how wonderful it is to be able to smell something so refreshing after what they've just been through. However, Sweeney is always kind of like a step ahead in the game, and he kind of realizes that there is this big paper trail leading back to him. But in his mind, he has his £8,000, he's got rid of Tobias, and now he just needs to tie up some other loose ends and get the hell out of Britain. So the first ingredient in getting away with it is murdering your accomplice. He decides to buy poison, and he intends to use this poison for Mrs. Lovett. However, lo and behold, at the same time, Tobias escapes the asylum and runs for it. He plans to tell the authorities, everyone, about what is going on in Sweeney Todd's barbershop. Joanna, now dressed up as a boy, spies a vacancy in Sweeney Todd's shop. She applies and Sweeney accepts. A really blasé customer comes in and says, "Hey, look, I just bought this brand new string of pearls down the road. Could you tell me what they're worth?" As like some kind of valuation thing. I'm not really sure why he goes to Sweeney for this, but ironically he did. Joanna accidentally cuts the barber chair whilst passing a razor to Sweeney, and he's like, "Get out! You must leave me alone conveniently with this string pearl bearer," and so she does. So then Joanna obviously returns and discovers that, oh my god, where did he go? He's gone, and not only that, but also the mark that was on that chair. How suspicious. So she realizes something really, really odd is going on at this point, which at this point of the story may make Joanna a bit of a liability, but the reality is that Todd could care less because he has everything now in his hands, and he decides that he's going to leave England for good. He goes to Mrs. Lovett's pie shop, and as his final act of covering it all up, poisons her. So in addition to all the evidence that they have against Sweeney, Joanna adds her evidentiary layer to the matter. And so Joanna, Sir Richard Blunt, and 2 police officers go into Sweeney Todd's barbershop to try and kind of catch him in the act. Richard enters the shop pretending to be a customer, and when Sweeney leaves to go and pull the mechanical lever to kill Richard, Richard hops out of the seat and they witness the revolving mechanical chair trap.
Sounds like a Saw thing.
Yeah. Not to be confused with Saw. So the murder part of the scheme is completely thwarted. They're like, woohoo, we got our killer, the awful smell, you know, that was obviously just the bodies that he was cutting up as part of it. But then no, lo and behold, Jarvis Williams appears, because apparently he escaped via a lift and a tray of pies. Don't ask me how. And he pops up and he has this wonderful quote that gets regurgitated from here on out for a little bit of Sweeney Todd's lore. He says, "Ladies and gentlemen, I fear that what I am going to say will spoil your appetites, but the truth is beautiful at all times, and I have to state that Mrs. Lovett's pies are made of human flesh." Mrs. Lovett, who is here at this point, is just a bit like, oh, here it is. Convenient poison. She drops dead before being able to explain any of her actions, and everyone's just kind of stood there like, oh. You would think that discovering that your bakery was serving human flesh would be enough to make anyone kind of revolted as the ending, like some kind of tragic sad, disgusted ending. But no, nobody cares. And the reality is because Joanna has just noticed that Mark Ingistry has just walked into the room. Mark Ingistry, whose alias is somehow now Jarvis Williams. Because when Mark got to London, he overheard a conversation with Joanna and her friend, and he believed that Joanna was being false to him. So he never declared himself to her, and he decided to become emaciated and poor, not tell anyone that he wasn't actually lost at sea, and apply for a pie shop job, which ended up ensnaring him. So, happy ending, I guess. Despite all of this, Mark and Joanna decide to get married, Tobias testifies for Sweeney's guilt, and the sentence for her hanging is passed. The story ends with Tobias in Mark's employment, the couple are happily married, the crimes are resolved, and the villain's dead for what they've done. So, yeah, quite a lot to unpack there. So as you can see, The String of Pearls really took inspiration from the story of Rue de la Harpe, but it ran with it and turned it into this crazy penny dreadful, which has all of its nuance, turns, twists, added characters. It was an adaptation, but it was an absolutely beefy one at that. I think if you wanted to unpack all of the literary influences that came into The String of Pearls, it would take a whole video within itself. One thing to really take on board with the periodical and the further book adaptation was that, of course, in the prologue it stated that it was completely founded on fact, which wasn't uncommon for penny dreadfuls at the time, to create type of hype, get people to invest in the idea a little bit more, get them a little bit scared about it. It's a bit like today when they say, oh, the movie's based on a true event, and then you have people like flying over trains and doing the most crazy action sequences that no human could ever complete. But because the serial was so popular, Sweeney Todd began to be incorrectly referenced as a real historical figure. And this was even corroborated with some kind of evidence that he lived at 186 Fleet Street, and that some bones were found under one of the houses at Fleet Street, and therefore Sweeney Todd must have been a real figure. But the most important thing to take away from the whole thing is that he was ripped into British folklore at this point, to the point that he became an urban legend, someone that you would suspect would have further origins than what he even has now. Ironically, what was a deterrent for the French became its own manifested story of intrigue and mystery within British culture, and adopted as its own kind of story. Like, oh no, those French aren't cannibals, we are. But before the serial had even finished by early 1847, its popularity was absolutely undeniable, to the point where a play version was put on in the Hoxton's Britannia before the serial had even published its conclusion. Scandalous. Nestled in London's borough of Hackney, in an area named Hoxton, used to sit a theatre named the Britannia Theatre, which Charles Dickens in 1861 described as fresh, wholesome, and cool. But in its heyday, it was a house of theatre, musical, and pantomime, some even going as far to say it was one of the most important theatres of its time. Well, on the 1st of March 1847, a melodrama by George Dibdin Pitt was put on to an absolutely roaring success. The name of this piece? The String of Pearls, subtitled The Fiend of Fleet Street. So, how did it differentiate from the periodical? Well, it's worth reminding you that George Dibdin Pitt obviously adapted the periodical before the periodical even had a chance to finish itself. So there's obviously some differences there. And another thing to note is there are no surviving or definitive copies of the script, because that would make this whole process a lot easier, and like every iteration of Sweeney Todd, everything was just designed to make it completely difficult to unearth. There was a published version of this play which entered the Lord Chamberlain's collection by 1883, but as far as we know, this is completely different in both name and in content from the original version that went on in the Britannia. Because, of course. Furthermore, for those that don't know, a quick rundown about the Lord Chamberlain is that the works that used to enter his type of collection were highly censored. The reason being is because they were trying to upkeep some type of morality or preserve some type of morality. So things like gore and horror and slashing people and throwing them down mechanical chutes obviously wasn't something that they wanted published within their collection. There's a lot of versions out there that claim to be close to the truth or close to the original staging or definitive in this kind of approach, but the reality is they're largely speculative. And the reason being is they kind of use the 1883 version as a guide. which as we know is not exactly as close to the truth as we would like it to be. Even based on the copies that I looked into and know about include Marvin Kaye's version, Sharon Weltman's version, Brian Burton's version, Montague Slater's version, and the list goes on and on and on and on and on. So you can rest assured that Dibdin Pitt received his karma for stealing from the periodical by having his work enter a literary meat grinder. But not all is lost. A transcript of the opening night's playbill is held by the British Library, in which we can observe that Pitt added comedy characters to lighten the mood. It reads, "Taken from the much-admired tale of that name, founded on fact, in Lloyd's People's Periodical. For dramatic effect and to adapt the story to general taste, some alterations have been judiciously made, enhancing the interest. The comic characters are rich and varied, the laughable voraciousness of the hungry Jarvis, the bluff humour of the beef-eater, the exposé of the fanatical moorworm Dr. Lupin, and the canting Mrs. Oakley serve to lighten and relieve the more serious portion of the subject and afford a strong and excellent moral lesson. The whole is indeed a picture of human nature replete, as human nature is, with light and shade, and cannot fail both to amuse and instruct." By process of elimination of the other versions, Sharon Weltman's script actually uses these characters, whilst others tend to omit them. So by that kind of logic, I think it's fair to say that Sharon Weltman's script, or the one that she utilises in her Academia, is more likely the one that would have been used in the Britannia at this time, or as close as it's gonna be. Weltman, an English professor from Louisiana State University, theorises that the inclusion of jaunty tunes, moral lessons, and comedy characters was a way to appeal to the domestic workers that would have frequented the Britannia at the time. It's also worth noting that it was very likely that the audience of the Britannia Theatre couldn't read and write too well, so this was their first iteration of Sweeney Todd that wasn't given to them through word of mouth. As we can surmise from the playbill, Cecily Maybush was a part that was written specifically for the comedy actress Sarah Lane, who would frequent the Britannia Theatre. She would actually receive top billing for her part in this. She would share that same top billing with the actress who played Tobias Ragg, Mrs. Hudson Kirby. But when you have such great lines such as,
"Dear me, this is the first time I heard a bear say he was a muffin maker,"
at the climax of the story in Act 2, well, you of course deserve top billing. Speaking of iconic lines, it was also acknowledged that Dibdin Pitt was the one that added the famous motif, "I'll polish him off" for Sweeney Todd. Todd would usually say this to the side of the stage before going in and murdering his client. This saying became a trope that was associated to Sweeney Todd from here really on out in all of his future iterations and adaptations. It wasn't until we got to the more recent portrayals that this kind of saying dropped off in association to Sweeney Todd. It's likely that it was cut due to the fact that it's a bit of a euphemism now, and the somewhat death of serious melodrama by proxy of assimilation to pantomime. Anyway, beyond polishing men off, Maybush-esque characters, educating the lower classes, there were certain changes made to the stage adaptation. These include the inclusion of music, Tobias and Joanna are thrown into the asylum, Sweeney Todd stabs his victims with his razor before pushing them off down the revolving chair. There's even the inclusion of a choral number to open Act 2, which talks about how successful and how lovely Mrs. Lovett's meat pies are. These are changes that were maintained, give or take, for future adaptations, and we'll get to those. Another change was the dog from the periodical, Hector, which was played as a black child in this production by an actress named Mrs. Roby. Sweeney says on the matter, "Excuse my mentioning such a thing, but I should not be able to operate with that black boy in the room. 'Tis an idle prejudice, I grant, but as some persons have an aversion to a cat, a rat, a hedgehog, or a spider, such is my feeling at the sight of a black boy. Will you indulge me, sir, by requesting him to leave the shop?" Sweeney Todd being a maniacal serial murderer wasn't enough. Dibdin Pitt also decided to make him a racist. Weltman concluded that Hector, both in dog and child form, was omitted by the play's publication in 1883, and largely became assimilated to the character of Tobias Ragg in future adaptations. So we have the story of the Rue de la Harpe, then we have the Telltale's version of the Rue de la Harpe, then we have the String of Pearls, the periodical, which is a version of that Telltale magazine version. Then we have the stage adaptation of The String of Pearls, which took influence from The String of Pearls, the periodical. And then finally, we have the novel. After the heightening success of the periodical and play, the publishers wasted no time in trying to get a novel assembled. Now, it wasn't just any old novel, it was an absolute behemoth. It was published in 1850 and stood at around 730 pages long, which was about around the same size as the unedited version of the script. But what did it do differently? Well, it tells for most the same story, and like all of its formers, testified that it was based on fact, the preface stating, "In answer to the many inquiries that have been from time to time made regarding the fact of whether there ever was such a person as Sweeney Todd in existence, we can unhesitatingly say that there certainly was such a man, and the record of his crimes is still to be found in the chronicles of criminality of this country." But, like every iteration on this tale, the novel of course expanded greatly on the base material. Arguably, what happened was that the publishers took the best of the play version, the best of the periodical, and the best of further adaptations, and kind of just smushed it all together into one extremely long book. Now, I guess you could say that the novel, in a sense, is a kind of compendium of the String of Pearls and its adaptations in one. Anyway, it goes as far as to change the ending so that Sweeney escapes from prison, goes on a bit of a murdering spree, and then is eventually shot dead by the police. This is after numerous trials, escapes, murders, and pure telenovela-esque shenanigans. Mrs. Lovett turns into a sort of tragic Lady Macbeth figure that is kind of internally haunted by her actions, and literally haunted by her actions because she is also haunted by ghosts. She tries to kill herself, Sweeney tries to kill her multiple times, Sweeney also tries to kill himself. Honestly, this whole novel, the second half after the String of Pearls has ended, ends up in this kind of roundabout as to who's gonna die first out of the two of them. But as per canon, Mrs. Lovett dies first after multiple attempts on not just her life, but then herself also considering ending her own life early. There's even a line towards the end of the book that talks about how hard she is to kill. There's all sorts of character adaptations and changes. Heck, Lupin even goes from this kind of weirdo that's betrothed to Joanna through Joanna's mother to ending up becoming Sweeney's accomplice, aiding him in his murder sprees, and then is eventually murdered by Sweeney. Honestly, it's all a bit wild, but hey, as a positive, the novel is also a big source of the illustrations that you've seen throughout this video. Whilst these endings and character adaptations ultimately didn't stick into the lore that we presently know Sweeney Todd, it just goes to show how much, fans were demanding for extra content in terms of stringing out the String of Pearls. Hey. Here thereafter, this version of Sweeney Todd was immortalised from further literary adaptations, stage adaptations, and even film adaptations from 1850 all the way through to 1970. But notable ones include a film adaptation in 1936. Now, I know there was a film in 1928, but it ended with the cliche of "it was all a bad dream," so it doesn't count. Anyway, back to 36. Todd Slaughter was an English actor who dedicated his later career to playing melodramatic villains, but was most notable for his portrayal of Sweeney Todd. The movie streamlined the periodical and added new plot lines such as Sweeney being the one that wanted to marry Joanna in place of Lupin.
Ah, Joanna, you've met Mr. Todd before, haven't you?
You are looking more lovely than ever tonight, Miss Joanna.
You're very kind, sir.
She takes after mean looks and her mother in willfulness.
Dinner is served, sir.
Will you take my daughter in, Mr. Todd?
Delighted.
Mrs. Lovett aids the escape of Mark Street and in general is kind of shirked by her whole deal that she has with Sweeney.
And where's my share of what you took from him?
Don't worry. You'll get it.
The movie ends with Sweeney setting the barbershop on fire with Joanna inside. Mark saves Joanna and kills Sweeney in the fabulous process. I've linked it below for anyone interested in watching it because yes, whilst it was made as a somewhat quote-a-quickie, it did cement Todd Slaughter as one of the more reputable versions of Sweeney Todd. In general, the movie kind of took out the previous editions and made a bit more of a coherent melodrama out of what was already in place. Is it goofy? Yes, but up until this point, Sweeney was as feared as a panto dame, a caricature to kind of be laughed at now. The movie kind of refined that and brought it back to its campy horror roots. But as you can probably see in these iterations, whether it be dancing, acting, or singing, the villains' motivations largely remain the same. That is, through their greed for money, pushes them to embark upon their criminal careers and do what they do.
Money.
Now, what happens when we remove that greed? What happens when we remove that core, basic aspect of Sweeney Todd and Mrs. Lovett's characteristics and replace it with something like revenge? Jumping ahead into the 1970s, Sweeney had been crafted as this wicked Machiavellian type whose greed was too good to last and caught up with him each and every time. Well, that was until Christopher Bond got involved, who arguably created the Sweeney that we know today, the Sweeney that was directly lifted for the musical adaptation by Sondheim in 1979. Well, as discussed before, Sweeney was composed from various folklore, anecdotes, propaganda, the borrowing of other people's works. So why stop there, right? Well, Christopher Bond acknowledged this, and he wrote in his author notes, "However, I've cast my net wider than anyone else in borrowing from other authors. I make no apology for this. After all, as the man himself said, a beggar may eat of a fish that have fed of a worm that have ate of a king. I have borrowed from, amongst others, the Count of Monte Cristo, the Revenger's Tragedy, the Spanish Tragedy, the Family Greengrocer, and Shakespeare, as well as Dibdin Pitt's original melodrama." So, what did he do differently? Well, using these references, as well as his own storytelling capabilities, Bond introduced most of the contemporary elements that we can recognise within Sweeney Todd today. Sweeney is no longer the antagonist of the story, and instead is this sympathetic, tragic anti-hero who has just returned to London after being exiled from Australia.
Exiled from Australia, what would you have to do for that one?
Who has just returned to London after being exiled to Australia on false charges. Mrs. Lovett at this point is also a more fully fleshed and developed character with her own backstory rather than being a side piece or side plot to Sweeney's character. The story is reshaped as most know it today, with Joanna being Sweeney Todd's daughter and her investigative journalism career being fully over. The sailor, Mark Ingastry, becomes Anthony Hope, and the characters of Hector and Jarvis become fully assigned to the character of Tobias Ragg. In addition, you get the introduction of several other key characters such as Judge Turpin, Pirelli, and also Lucy Barker / Beggar Woman. It has to be said that if you already know the musical version of Sweeney Todd, then essentially you already know Christopher Bond's play, because in terms of plot and character progression, they are almost identical. You know, even within the lines, it almost seems as if the musical ripped out the book line by line to tell this story of revenge consuming everyone and everything in its path, including Sweeney Todd himself. And when I say line by line, I mean it. And even with the majority of the plot changed to fit this new revenge narrative, a lot of kind of touches and nods and past iterations made their way through into Bond's script. For example, the Beadle investigates a strange smell. Joanna is thrown into a madhouse. Joanna dresses in boys' clothes for one reason or another. Someone works for Mrs. Lovett in exchange for food. And then, of course, you have Sweeney Todd killing Mrs. Lovett. Tobias even gets the classic line from the 1847 play with the whole discovery of the pies as, "For what I have to tell will, I fear, quite spoil your appetite. Mrs. Lovett's pies are made from human flesh." Bond created a lot of the grander plot elements that can be seen in Sweeney Todd. However, he also created a lot of the nuanced characteristics that are viewable too, such as Mrs. Lovett's fantasy escapism to the seaside. You've got Pirelli being Cockney. In addition, you've also got the discovery of the meat pies, which is found through Tobias discovering hair and then a fingernail in the meat grinder. Bond simply puts it that he gave Sweeney additional motive, and with it came complexity. He said, "Well, I gave him a reason for what he does. The joy of Sweeney is that it can be done so many different ways. I've seen it so many times, yet I'm still not sure who the biggest villain of the piece really is. Is it Sweeney? Is it Mrs. Lovett? Who's leading who?" But I mean, arguably, Bond did so much more than that. Of course he added motive, but he also added a plot line of mystery, tragedy, and more soap opera drama than a Christmas special of EastEnders. The original periodical and play, as much as they are full of intrigue and novel ideas, are kind of messy in their execution. And with every iteration and every adaptation of Sweeney Todd, the whole concept became more and more clouded. Bond actually said on the matter, it needed a heart transplant, not a facelift. And I kind of have to agree with him. Bond put the story back on track by removing that element of greed from Sweeney Todd and not making him this merciless, Machiavellian murderer, but rather making him a bit more thoughtful, a bit more sympathetic, a little bit more relatable, kind of. And through that, created the Sweeney that we know today, which wasn't bad for his first play, really. The flexibility and mystery added by Bond kind of gave free rein to now how Mrs. Lovett and Bond could be portrayed. Bond. The flexibility and mystery added by Bond kind of gave free rein to how Todd and Mrs. Lovett could be interpreted, in a way that was kind of never really seen before. In fact, the director, Maxwell Shaw, said on the matter, "In the true style of melodrama, however, the actors would be encouraged to express their emotions freely and fully, with truth, but without overacting." Now, by losing the greed motive, it meant things like the pearls needed to be adapted. The reason being is because the pearls are kind of the crux of what is happening to gear the action in the original Sweeney Todd. Now, the pearls shift in Bond's play into becoming the character Joanna. The reason being is because she is stolen, she's repossessed, she's the desire of want for a lot of characters, from Judge Turpin, from Anthony, from Sweeney Todd himself. They all have a claim and a stake in what Joanna is doing and where she is. This unfortunately removes her investigative endeavours that we were shown in previous iterations of herself, and this is because she's kind of objectified in meta and in universe. You know, she shows defiance as a character, of course, but the reality is she is cargoed around, she's transported about, rescued and kidnapped, as if she were a pearl, and it's never really through her own agency that these mechanisms happen. In fact, the judge leaves the door unlocked at one point, giving her an opportunity to leave, where she remarks, "In his agitation he has left the door unlocked. I may again gaze from the window in the hope that my love will come. Oh, come on, wings of love so swift, and bear me hence at once. But till that time come, I'll sing to pass the hours." Also, added note, but she also does shoot a guy, so there's obviously props for that. A pearl couldn't logistically do that if you really want to fight about it in the comments, but When Christopher Bond said that he was borrowing from other people's works and made no apology for it, well, the same artistic liberties were applied to himself. As we all know by now, the story of Sweeney Todd is one of borrowing rather than being definitive. Which brings us to...
It was a telegram from Arthur Lawrence and Stephen Sondheim. And it was saying, would you be interested in playing the part of Nellie Lovett in a musical version of the Demon Barber of Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street? And, well, I looked at Peter, and when I read the wire, I said, well, that's interesting. It's a very interesting idea. Because as children, we had both been brought up with this kind of legendary bogeyman who was Sweeney Todd, who slit people's throats and made meat pies out of them. So I thought, well, it's certainly something to consider, and they're very enthusiastic, these two, and obviously they're brilliant. They must have something up their sleeve.
The Demon Barber of Fleet Street.
Another costume change.
No set change because our house isn't big enough.
Yeah, this is you get pea green guys to match the other greens going around. Expanding upon Christopher Bond's work in the same decade, we have Stephen Sondheim's take on the Demon Barber. And whilst, yes, it doesn't deviate wholly away from Bond's text, it definitely added flair, notoriety, and above all, some of Sondheim's best work in it. Sondheim himself said about Bond's version that it had a weight to it, because Bond wrote certain characters in blank verse. He also infused into it plot elements from Jacobean Tragedy and The Count of Monte Cristo. He was able to take all of these disparate elements that had been in existence rather dully for 100 and some odd years and make them into a first-rate play. And in turn, Sondheim was able to take all of those elements that existed in Bond's version and turn it into a mesmerising, intelligent and beautiful score that, in all honesty, needs to be admired on its own merit. Like the periodical in 1842, the play version in 1847 only ever heightened its success, while 100 and some odd years later, the exact same thing happened again, with Bond's version existing in 1973, and by 1979, a much popular stage adaptation had occurred. And popular is a bit of an understatement. It won many accolades from the 1979 Tony Award and the 1980 Olivier Award for Best Musical, has had many global revivals, and is often revered as one of the all-time musical greats. In a lot of ways, the success of the musical adaptation solidified Bond's new narrative for Sweeney Todd as the mainstream consensus, albeit under Sondheim's name. Sondheim's score and Hal Prince's staging elevated this version of Sweeney Todd to a pedestal level that is almost unshakable against its predecessors. Christopher Bond actually commented on this and wrote, "I've directed the musical version 7 times. I did it in Berlin, Sweden, Liverpool, Watford, Holland Park, and a couple of other places. How much credit shall I take for it? 10%? The story's mine, and the characters are mine, but really, Stephen turned it into something amazing." So, considering Bond said that the story was his, and the characters were his, what did Hugh Wheeler and Stephen Sondheim add to create this new version of Sweeney? Beyond, the obvious. Arguably, the biggest changes within the story come from the character of the beggar woman / Lucy Barker and her actions. In Bond's play, Mrs. Lovett tells Sweeney that Lucy poisoned both herself and Joanna, but with Joanna surviving the attack. Additionally, as the beggar woman, Lucy comes across much less unhinged than she does in Sondheim's world. She interacts with the characters a lot more. In one such interaction, she warns Tobias not to eat the pies, which he promptly shrugs off. Potentially, Lucy having less stage time in the musical was to ensure that the twist of the beggar woman wasn't as obvious. Another example change is how Tobias gets locked in the bakehouse. In Bond's version, Sweeney and Mrs. Lovett see Lucy telling Tobias about the pies, and so they view him as a liability. Subsequently, Mrs. Lovett decides to lock him up in the bakehouse, as opposed to the musical, where he's the one who grows suspicious of Sweeney after seeing Pirelli's coin purse, which, in a way, acts as the hat that the dog/child from previous versions picks up after their owner is killed. So, despite these kind of cleaning the edges examples, the majority of Bond's text illustrates not just the characters, but also some of the musical lyrics of Sondheim's score, from Worst Pies in London through to Joanna Quartet. There are songs which are wholly new additions such as Greenfinch and Linnetbird, Our Miss, Joanna, Pretty Women, Not While I'm Around, whose content was created solely for the musical by Sondheim. Even the judge's self-flagellation scene, which was present in Bond's text, was actually removed for the original Broadway production, but then ended up finding its way back into the text for future versions. But, I mean, you could sit here and argue until you're blue in the face about whose version it is, or whose credit is greater in terms of Bond's and Sondheim's work. But, time and time again, what's really proven is that Sweeney Todd is a tale of adaptation. Cha-ching. Like the grinding machine pouring out the ground meat, Sondheim's version isn't without its own adaptations, and its own evolutions, which just kind of adds Sweeney Todd to this cyclical nature of a continuous metamorphosis. The 2007 movie adaptation, directed by Tim Burton, added a lot of stylistic flair and morose personality to Sondheim's work, again showcasing the flexibility that Sweeney and Mrs. Lovett have. It didn't alter the story, but rather streamlined it and elevated the story again to a wider platform. Whilst the days of polishing off were far behind him, Sweeney Todd became almost a mainstream image with black and white hair, pale makeup, tall and slender, and with a lot of Burton-esque costumes. The iconicism attributed to his look, and this movie, meant that Sweeney could now be correctly identified in all of the Halloween parties in the land and perhaps a lineup if necessary. However, the movie didn't really add much beyond what Bond, Wheeler and Sondheim had already created, because it was a diluted rehashing of Sondheim's musical. And Sondheim took a bit of artistic control in terms of how far his piece could be adapted, even apparently being the one to audition the roles of Mrs. Lovett and Sweeney Todd. Though it was no surprise to anyone that Tim Burton alumni Johnny Depp and Helena Bonham Carter would play the roles.
Oh, I gotta ask you about this. You had to be approved by Stephen Sondheim before you could even do the project?
Oh God, yeah. I had to be approved by my husband too. Or not, he's not my husband, but, the father of my two bastards.
The movie may not have added to the story, but it definitely furthered renown and catapulted Sweeney back into public interest in the 21st century. Like Bond and Sondheim wrote about their predecessors, it's a blank slate to work with, and whilst the musical does add perhaps a more formulaic beat due to the music, that doesn't mean it can't be adapted, altered, or enhanced. The 2004 London revival made a stylistic choice to have a small cast who play their own instruments, which transferred to Broadway in 2005. The 2012 London production set the musical in the 1930s. The 2014 Dutch touring opera production made even further stylistic choices, and in the same year there was a progressive rock version of the musical produced in Washington, DC. Like the sun setting, this video must also come to an end.
Finally.
It's just taken a while. To hail back to Christopher Bond, who said that the joy of Sweeney is that it can be told in a variety of ways, is absolutely true. There isn't just one Sweeney Todd, even if one is perhaps more popular than the other right now. It's a legend that is really open for interpretation in terms of entertainment purposes, and has been repurposed, repackaged, and already told in such a variety of ways. But in a lot of ways, it's a love letter to its earliest self, with constant nods to its predecessors. In the future, there will certainly be more. So, that's a wrap. Thank you so much for attending the Tales of Sweeney Todd. It certainly is an interesting case. I'd love to hear your opinion on the matter in the comments. I always read all of them. Please be sure to like and subscribe. We have lots more content coming, and I will check you next time. Thank you so much. Bye.